Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Southern California Grantmakers 2018 Annual Conference. Please welcome to the stage the President and CEO of SCG, Chris Essel.
Welcome everyone to this year's annual conference. Thank you all for being here. It's my honor to open today's series of conversations about our common humanity. As I look around the room at this amazing community of leaders, the deeply collaborative nature of our work comes into sharp focus. Each of us come to this moment, however, from a different professional perspective: a foundation, a corporate funder, a government agency, here in Los Angeles, around the region, or some even have come from farther away. We also bring our personal backgrounds and life experiences, which shape our perspectives and the way we see the world. And we focus our day-to-day work on different matters: education, homelessness, health, immigration, along with so many other vital issues. And yet, despite the varying demands we face, we are here this morning because we know that our successes and our failures are innately intertwined. Even as we grapple with the deep divisions that challenge our communities and our country, we nonetheless still belong to a common humanity. There is an inherent dignity shared by all members of the human family that spans across our differences. Our common humanity gives us hope, it powers our work, and binds together so many of us, from the SCG staff, our members and our partners, and the communities where we live and do our work. And yet, as we examine our work in this moment, we must ask ourselves some challenging questions. So why is it that the same problems and the same inequities continue to persist and reemerge over and over again for so many of the same communities? Why are schools and neighborhoods still segregated more than 50 years after the end of Jim Crow? And as we fund programs that provide shelter or food or education or housing for those in need, are we not addressing, perhaps not even seeing, the deeper challenges that enable these inequities in the first place, including the harsh realities of racism, as well as gender discrimination, ableism, age discrimination, and homophobia? And is this inequity inherently baked into the systems and institutions or the policies and practices that perpetuate the very problems we are trying to solve? We approach today's conference response to questions like these that we have heard from you, as our conferences these past few years have delved deeper into the underlying inequities that create and recreate these unacceptable conditions. Many of you have said to us, thanks for the insights, and now what can we do about that? In fact, 87% of our members surveyed late last year asked us to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion as a top priority. Hearing this call from you, SCG is embracing our common humanity and translating the core message into action throughout the year. Over the past few months, under the Philanthropy California banner, which is our alliance with San Diego and Northern California Grantmakers, who are both in attendance today, we took action to help coordinate an ad campaign opposing the separation of parents and children at the southern border. In addition, we endorsed a statement by grantmakers concerned with immigrants and refugees, issuing a public condemnation of family disruption. And in so doing, we became part of a wave of civic engagement that ultimately forced a change in this misguided policy. So together we were able to leverage our financial resources, our knowledge of the issues, and our unique voice to good effect. Another example, our Philanthropy California delegation sat down with leaders in Sacramento to draw attention to the crucial importance of adequately funding a fair and accurate census in which literally everyone counts. As a result of our delegation's timely discussions with key policymakers, we successfully helped to secure $90 million in the California budget, more than doubling the governor's proposed funding for the census. It is clear to us that our participation, along with the work of our allies, was essential in this victory. This year also saw us make great strides on the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Los Angeles initiative. As you may know, the Kellogg Foundation, also with us today, has selected SCG to be the backbone organization for this multifaceted partnership of philanthropy, nonprofits, government, business, and community leaders. Our vision is to plan for and bring about transformational and sustainable change by addressing the historic and contemporary effects of racism in our region. All these advances give me hope and help provide us with a path forward. So whether you know these truths through your lived experience, or you're already on this journey, or perhaps you're just beginning to explore these issues, you are in the right place. Throughout the conference, we'll learn from dozens of leading speakers and from each other across keynotes and breakouts, focusing on today's 3 tracks, all conceived with an equity lens and, of course, with a heavy emphasis on racial equity, because in the end, true equity cannot be achieved without addressing the racism that persists in our society. So this is a very different conversation than we had 5 years ago at my first annual conference, which was our 40th anniversary. It was a great party. But we have grown so much together in our scope and impact and courage. Of course, there's much that has not changed, like the values that drew us to this field in the first place, and our deep belief that effective philanthropy can help create and inspire meaningful change in the world around us. However, we are seeing a bit more clearly now. We are seeing the truth of the work that is ahead of us. We are seeing each other more clearly in our own organizations, across the SCG network, in our communities and our country. We see how connected we truly are. We see our common humanity. That is what brings us here today, and it will lead us forward together. Thank you. In the spirit of connection, I want to take a moment and give thanks to those who make our work possible. Let's start with our presenting sponsors for this annual conference. The Annenberg Foundation, the California Community Foundation, the Conrad and Hilton Foundation, and the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation. And our gold sponsors, thank you to the Amgen Foundation, City Community Development, the Walt Disney Company, KPMG, Weingart Foundation, and Wells Fargo. In addition, we have a record number of silver, bronze, and donor-level sponsors. Let's take a moment to absorb all those names. Impresses me. Please join me now in thanking all of our sponsors for their generosity. I'm also always extremely grateful to our operating funders who truly sustain our work throughout the year. Our operating funders are here on the slide. Let's give them a round of applause, too. And now I'd like to thank the incredibly talented SCG team. Let's just give them a big round of applause. They inspire me every day, and they've worked so very hard on this conference. I want to call out especially Tuli Martinez, our amazing Director of Programs and Conferences. Last but not least, certainly I want to recognize our thoughtful, strategic, and stellar board of directors. Let's give them some love, too. Now join me in welcoming someone to the stage who exemplifies the humanity and heart of this work we all do, our wonderful board chair, Beatrice Solis.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning. Wow, it's so awesome. Monday morning, to see so many bright faces. Very exciting, especially from this spot. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone, for showing up today. It's an important day. We've got a lot of interesting things that are going to be happening. So put on your seatbelt and get ready to go. I have to say that I'm extremely proud to be board chair of SCG. It's been a wonderful, exciting journey, and I would be remiss if I didn't, at the beginning of this presentation, just give a shout out again to the staff. So if you would just, for a moment, acknowledge them one more time, because the amount of work and thought is amazing. I also want to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Tongva people, and we pay our respect to elders both past and present. And we can't proceed without recognizing that there is a disaster on the East Coast. We are thinking about our colleagues in philanthropy, family and friends, and everyone in the storm's path. As always, SCG will keep you informed about the disaster response and how philanthropy can help over the short and long term. So let's hold good thoughts for everybody over there. So we come together today at a pivotal inflection point for Californians and for Americans. For many of us, 2018 has thoroughly tested the scope of our investments in education, environmental protection, the public safety net, immigration, and even at times our own morality. So today seems an ideal time to test ourselves, to probe more deeply into what motivates us as individuals, to push us past caution about what we say or tweet or share, and to stretch. Instead, we need to move to more concrete, achievable, and real-world results for the diverse and deserving inhabitants of this beautiful state that we call home, the Golden State. But first, as best we can, let's agree to put political partisanship aside. After all, it can only keep us at arm's length from a fuller, clearer understanding of our common humanity, for the very thing we are here today to celebrate. Today's conference is smartly designed to move briskly along 3 very specific programming tracks, and each of you, our dear SCG members, gets to choose your own adventure. But before you begin, here's a brief overview of your missions, should you choose to accept them. Our first track, Partnerships and Collaborations, reminds us of the unifying power in this room and of deeply intertwined nature of our work and our interests. The second, Professional Development, points its focus at the future, enabling each of us to expand the scope and complexity of our work and of ourselves. And the third track zeroes in on some inescapable and perhaps uncomfortable realities in America. On this track, we'll explore subjects of racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Far from being buzzwords or workplace obligations, these interests directly confront the explicit and implicit biases we all carry. They speak to who belongs and who is othered. They articulate our distance from a full actualization of the American dream, and they help set us a course to close the gap. Given the crisis to our children today, from the southern border to our classrooms, the call to explore how these issues intersect with trauma and mental health, especially in young, is urgent and essential. These topics will be explored in today's plenaries in highly personal and profound ways by our guests, John Powell and Daniel Beatty. We are so excited to have both of them with us today. As Program Director of Healthy Communities South at the California Endowment, I've been deeply engaged in the psychological toll that socioeconomic hardship, threats of violence, and othering can impose on various communities, especially on communities of color. Decades ago, such communities that include myself and my family, were simply written off as less than others, as victims of faulty genetics and DNA. Today, thankfully, we know better. We know, for example, that years upon years of displacement by gentrification, inadequate educational systems, and imbalanced criminal justice practices dramatically impede an individual's ability to thrive. We now recognize, not just through anecdotes, but through data, that trauma experienced during childhood and youth will proceed headlong on a powerful and compounding trajectory well into adulthood, a direct trajectory that often includes self-harm and substance abuse. Today is a chance for us to better understand that the hardships and threats and traumas experienced by so many of our underserved do not spring up out of nowhere. Instead, they reverberate as echoes of our country's deeply racialized past, a past we may sometimes prefer to believe we have buried, but a past, paradoxically, that is still here. And it falls to us as compassionate leaders and allies to relentlessly combat that past by first recognizing and acknowledging it exists in our present. I hope many of us will choose to do this today, because today, standing up here before so many friends and colleagues on a day dedicated to our common humanity, I can't help but reflect on my own past, my own complex racial identity and humanity. I am a daughter of a bracero, which means a strong arm in Spanish. My father entered this country through a program that brought Mexicans to labor in the fields. The pay was about 30 cents an hour. My father was a good man, and there's no question his hard work paved the way for my own success and for my siblings. We went, a story here is we went to the Orpheum Theater. I don't know how many are familiar with it or have been in that beautiful theater on Broadway. So I took my father there. It was a cinema that he used to go to in his youth. It was a special celebration of music of the golden age of Mexican cinema. I was really excited to surprise my father with those special tickets. Third row from the stage, live performances, nice dinner, and then the film. So I hunkered down beside him, eager to see his excitement. But to my surprise, he began to heave and cry. For a moment, I thought, geez, is he having a heart attack? What is going on? And he looked at me, and he sort of gathered his voice, and he said, "Mija, I've never sat before at the proscenium. Last time I was at this theater," he said, "I was in the balcony," and he pointed where the blacks and the Mexicans had to sit. And as we gather here today in celebration, seated in our own proscenium of success, I do hope we all take pride in how far California has come since the days of my father's youth. Philanthropy has played no small role in that cultural change, but we'd be mistaken not to recognize how much further we still have to go. For so many people within our state, across the country, that balcony still exists, and the view it offers above and apart, and so many of us, it is often too bleak and dark and far and too dangerous. So today, let's ask ourselves, what can we do to change that view? Well, one thing we can do to change that view is to look at things together, which is what SCG exists to help us do. To that end, let us ensure that continued strength and vision of SCG by taking a moment to affirm board leadership. And as many of you know in your experiences in life, in employment, and in other realms of your life, leadership matters, but it really matters now. So stepping into leadership when conversations can be challenging, when conversations might seem uncomfortable, but having a board that is willing to step in and support the amazing staff at SCG to enter these conversations is such a gift, and it's a gift to all of us. So with that, I would like to announce the committee, the nominations committee, has made their decision, and we have a slate that we want to share with you for a second term to serve on the board of SCG. James Alva, Kim Belshea, Lee Draper, Cara Esposito, Michael Fleming, Wendy Guerin, Shane Goldsmith, Melissa Harmon, Dietra Lind, Steve Nissen, Gabriela Robles, Belén Vargas, and Gerald Solomon. The SCG Board of Directors has approved this list of nominees to be presented to the full membership today. So do I hear a motion? Do I have a second? Any members opposed? All right, let's congratulate all of our returning board members. I'd also like to recognize 2 SCG board members who regrettably had to step down from the board this year. I know we are all so grateful for the longtime contributions of Jonathan Lorenzo Yorba and Antonio Manning. I am also pleased to announce 2 new board members that have been approved to fill the midterm vacancies left by Jonathan and Antonio. We have Peter Long of the Blue Shield of California Foundation, who will step on to the board as of January 1st, and Connie Malloy of the James Irvine Foundation, who is already adding her leadership and voice to the mix. So let's welcome them both. It is also my honor to announce our executive committee for 2019. We have already have steady hands at the helm as this year's slate continues in our current roles. So Nikki Irvine, Vice Chair, Melissa Harmon as Treasurer, Joe Lombarda as Secretary, Wendy Guerin as our immediate past Chair, and I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to continue serving as your board chair. To the entire SCG board, many thanks for your willingness to be servant leaders who will guide SCG forward into crucially important work as we are discussing today. Well, that concludes our business. So now we're going to shift gears and we move forward into our plenary keynote session with Professor John A. Powell. Professor Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and a wide range of issues including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the executive director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policy and practice that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomics in California and nationwide. In addition to being a professor of law and professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, John holds the Robert Haas Chancellor's Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. John has worked and lived all over the world and is one of the co-founders of the Place and Race Research Action Council. He serves on the board of several national organizations and has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. Following John's opening presentation, he will be joined on stage with our own Fred Elley, President and CEO of the Weingart Foundation for a dialogue about philanthropy's role in supporting strategies to build a most inclusive society. So at this time, please welcome John Powell.
Good morning. So it's great to be here and share with you some thoughts, and I'm looking forward to my conversation with Fred. And I have a few slides I want to show you, but mainly I want to talk to you. But I'm reminded of my friend Manuel Pastor, who says, if you have a PowerPoint, you only need two things, power and a point. So I hope I have at least one of those. But you can let me know afterwards. The work you're doing now, as Beatrice and Chris suggested, is so important. And it's becoming more important, not just for who you fund, but actually for the country and for the world. And I want to just give you a little context for that as we go forward. So we can think of the problem of the 21st century as the problem of othering. And it's something that's happening not just in the United States, it's happening all around the world. And it usually happens in the context of authoritarian leadership and around some designated other. And that designated other is vilified, walls are built, people are herded into camps. But it speaks to really a turning back on the fundamental principles that Chris talked about this morning, the fundamental principles of everybody belonging and having dignity. And the first, and maybe the most important thing we give to members of our society is a sense of belonging or not. And in the United States, this issue of belonging has been organized around many groups, but especially around race. And not just in terms of racialized population, but the very way we structured our country has been animated deeply by race. Most people won't realize that before the Civil War, it wasn't one party sitting on one side of the aisle and another party sitting on the other. It was where you stood on the question of slavery. That was the deep divide up until the Civil War. One could argue it still remains a deep divide in our country. So our basic laws, things like the Electoral College, came out of our animation and fear of the other. And in this case, the designated other were blacks, and then later Latinos and Native Americans. So the issue of othering is animated and specifically around race in the United States. And if we even sharpen it more, we could say not just racism or racialization, but anti-black racism, the sort of hostility that's deeply, profoundly showing up on all kinds of indicators as it relates to blacks, but also ends up defining whites. Now, whenever I talk about othering, some people quickly move to, well, if we could just, as Rodney King suggested, just all get along. We're all the same. And actually, it's not quite that simple. So the intervention for othering is not saming, but belonging. And belonging acknowledges that we are part of each other, but that we're not the same. We're constantly in a dynamic, complicated relationship with each other. And so we have to acknowledge that whether someone is a Muslim, whether someone is transgendered, whether someone is an immigrant, it matters. It matters to them and it matters to us. But it doesn't mean they're other. They still belong. And one way we say people belong or don't belong, and Chris mentioned this in her introduction, is the way we organize structures. And so it's not just, can we talk to each other? Can we just get along? How do we organize structures, whether it's our schools, our neighborhoods, who have access to credit? So one reason we have these enduring inequalities, these enduring disparities, it's not just because people are racist in terms of a personal sense, although we see that on the rise. It's not just because people are homophobic in a personal sense, although we see that on the rise. It's not just because people are anti-immigrant or because people erase Native Americans, although we see all of that on the rise, but it's the way we organize our structures themselves. John Rawls, a great political philosopher of the 20th century that no one read then and no one reads now, he said, if you want to know if society is just, don't focus on the people, focus on the institutions and institutional arrangements. I live in the Bay Area. It's almost as beautiful as Southern California. Some would say more. It's also very liberal. But we have deeply segregated schools. We have deeply segregated housing. We have deeply segregated workforce, not necessarily because of personal antipathy, but because of all of these structural arrangements. There's one writer who wrote a book called Being Black, Living in the Red. He argued that if we could eliminate all racial discrimination today, it would take between 500 and 1,000 years for blacks to catch up with whites. So we have to sort of look at the work the structures are doing. Why is it that our schools are segregated, and even more segregated in some respects, more than 50 years after Brown? Quietly segregated. Segregated in San Francisco, segregated in New York, not just the South. So our structures are doing some work, and we have to figure out how structures are both racialized and how they're marginalizing populations. Structures are not neutral. They do work. So part of the thing is, how do we make structures animate the kind of relationships and do the kind of work we want? So people with power, like the people in this room, one of the things we do is we organize structures. We make the rules of the game, and those rules are not evenly distributed. Structures impact our life outcome. Where we live, our zip code, help determines how long we live, how well we'll live. How can that be? And again, it's not saying that personal animus is not out there, but there's something that the structures are doing and not doing that we need to pay attention to. So I talked about othering and this sort of explosion of othering around the country. So what's around the world, excuse me. So what's happening now that's causing this to happen? Where there are a lot of things, but one way of thinking about it is rapid change creates anxiety in all mammals, but certainly in humans. And they were going through 4 tremendous changes on a global level. One is globalization. Another is climate change. A third is technology. And these are interrelated to some extent. But the fourth is migration. So if you look at expressions of othering around the world, they're almost always organized, not around climate, and not even necessarily technology. They're organized around globalization, and they're organized around the other coming to our borders. And so there's always this fear, in fact, this exaggerated fear of the other. And there is no natural other, and there's no natural us. Those are socially constructed. Amartya Sen, a Nobel economist, made the observation that homogeneity is a myth, it's a fiction. There has been no society that has been homogeneous. Now, we can divide societies through different things. Religion, race, the language you speak. As in Rwanda, how many cows you have. That genocide was organized around not people who were of different ethnicities, they were the same ethnicity. Not that they had a different language, they had the same language, but how many cows? And so these stories we tell matter. So as we see the sort of growing number of apparent others coming to our shores, being in our shores, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that anxiety? And there are a couple of things that can be done. So the anxiety is not shaped naturally. People don't figure this out at the individual level. This is the role that leaders, stories, and structures play. So there are 3 responses. One of them is called bonding. And bonding is basically, I define some group as my group. And it could be, I just came from Detroit, went to homecoming, but also to see my ailing family. So it could be my family, or it could be all Detroiters. All Detroiters, shout out to all Detroiters. All right. Or it could be that I'm from Berkeley. Go Bears. Or it can be that I'm over 6 feet, with all the tall people stand up. My point is, we all have multiple identities, and each of those identities have a story and a structure around it. Which of those become more present, more salient, depends on the story. So one is, I just like Detroiters. It's not that I don't like people from San Francisco, I just like Detroiters. That's bonding. Another response is breaking, where I say the other is some sort of existentialist threat to my being. And this is not hypothetical. There was a legislator in Arizona who noted that 60% of the children in schools in Arizona are kids of color. And his response was, this is an existentialist threat to America. He wasn't saying they're taking our jobs. He wasn't saying they're not Americans. He was saying they're not white. America not being majority white is an existentialist threat. Now, I don't know what he's suggesting as a solution, like tell these kids not to grow up. One of the things that happens in that situation is so that we don't fund the schools. There's research showing whenever majority of kids of color enter into a school system, the funding for that system always plummeted. So that's breaking. The other one is bridging. Bridging is recognizing that we have a common humanity, but not just recognizing it at the individual level, but also recognizing it in stories and culture and in structures. What do we do to actually say we belong to each other? What are the policies we need to pass? How do we organize space? How do we organize public transportation? And how do we engage the person? So this is the challenge. Can we have more bridging practices than breaking practices? And I would hasten to add that the majority of our practices still are either bonding or breaking, not bridging. And this is one of the areas I think philanthropy needs to actually exercise more leadership to actually affirmatively help people move into bridging spaces. And it's hard. And whenever I talk about bridges, one of the things I get back is that, do I have to bridge with, and you can pick, a Trump supporter or a Republican or a Democrat or a gay person or a trans. And I say, when you start building bridges, it's not easy. Start with short bridges. Don't start with the most difficult thing. And the short bridge might be your family member that you haven't talked to for a while. But we do need to bridge. And the bridge is not simply about the other, because there is no other. It's also about us. Do we have a common humanity? And if the answer is no, I would say we also don't have a world. Now, bridging means telling stories and practices where everybody belongs. But people are situated in structures and in our imagination in different ways. So this is work by Susan Fisk. It's called Stereotype Content Model. And she's done this now in 30 different countries. And in each country, there are a different set of groups that are designated as the ultimate other. And one axis is how much you like someone. The other axis is how competent you think they are. And so the top group, the gold standard, is someone you like and someone you think is competent. It's my posse. It's my group. But then you can like someone and not think they're very competent. And in her model, in the United States, she finds the elderly, women, disabled group, tend to fall into this second category. We like them, we just don't think they're competent. Certainly can't be president. The third group, we think they're competent. And these are all national samples, so this is not John Powell or Susan Fisk. This is what we as Americans think. The third group, we think they're competent, we just don't like them. And in that group, Asian Americans tend to fall into that group. Yeah, they can do math and all that, but, we don't like them. We're not inviting them to the party. And so it's a big deal that there was a movie made about Asians. Really? 60% of the world is Asian. Why is it taking so long to make a movie about that? And then the fourth group is the group that you don't think is very competent and you don't like them. And when you're in the far corner of this group, the part of the brain that lights up when we see another human being doesn't function. Nature thought it would be kind of cool that just you recognize someone of the same species. And so there literally are groups of people that we don't see as human. And in this group are young blacks and homeless people. And I've written and talked about we can't have effective policy toward people that we don't see as human. So we see these people as the ultimate other, not even human. So what do we need to do? We need to think about not just dealing with structural exclusion, but structural inclusion. Organize structures to do the work we want them to do. Organize structures to deliver the outcomes we want them to deliver. Organize structures to say people belong, and organize structures to build bridges. This problem of migration, to the extent that it is a problem, is going to explode. Climate change, which is uneven, is affecting the South more than it's affecting the North. It's caused by the North, affecting the South, and the people from the South come North, and then it's like, what are you doing here? We just destroyed their habitat. And so it's a deeply racialized process. It's not even. And it's something that most people believe is going to explode the migration patterns in the world. And so if we don't get this right, we're kind of screwed. So I want to end by talking about people are situated differently. One reason we can't all just get along, we can, hopefully, but we have to first acknowledge that we're not situated the same. And so when we build a structure, an escalator to get people to the third floor, a person comes along in a wheelchair. That structure does not work for them. We have to have structures that do the work, recognizing that people are situated differently. We have to recognize that we're all in the circle of human concern. And when I talk about being situated differently, that leads us into targeted universalism. We have universal goals, targeted strategies based on how we're situated differently. And we've done a lot of work on this, and we talk about in terms of opportunity structures. How do you organize opportunity structures differently for different populations? So the analysis, the research is important, but the research is not communication. So we need also to figure out how to communicate what we need to do. And communication is not narrative. A narrative is a deep story that stays pretty much the same even as the issues change. But a narrative by itself is not enough. We also need a strategy. How do we actually engage people? How do we understand people? How do we talk to people? What's the strategy? And finally, we need to organize, both at the philanthropy level, but also at the community level. So I'm going to invite Fred to the podium, and hopefully we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Artist party here.
You need this?
You know, if you would go back to your slide. Okay. Bridget, yeah. Okay. So good morning. Can you all hear me? So, John, there's only about 1 million things I want to ask you.
Oh, great. We'll have 2 answers.
So, we don't have a tremendous amount of time, so I want to get right into some questions about some of the core points you just brought up. And given the composition of this audience, I also want to talk about your thoughts on a role for philanthropy. You briefly touched on that a minute ago. So if we could, yes, thank you. We've gone back to graphic rapid change causes anxiety. And John, what you and I, when we talked in your office a couple weeks ago, we touched on this, and I want to go back to this conversation. When I first saw this graphic and I looked at the middle box, the leadership meta-narrative box, I wondered if, and you actually just mentioned, that you think that especially in the area of bridging, this is a role that maybe philanthropy can play. So I was going to ask you to talk more about this. Is this a role that providing leadership, constructing a meta-narrative or promoting a meta-narrative that bridges differences in communities, is this something that you think philanthropy can legitimately do?
Absolutely. I would even go further, though, not just in communities, but even among philanthropists themselves. So the way I would say, and I'm not, I have a deep understanding of philanthropy. I turn to Lori Villarosa when I have questions about philanthropy. But I know the way philanthropy funds actually exacerbate soft breaking, even as issues. Like, we only focus on climate change. We don't focus on climate change and social justice, or we only focus on housing, or we only focus on, without recognizing that even at a conceptual level, these things are deeply, profoundly interrelated. So how do we bridge them? It doesn't mean we have to do everything, but we have to understand the relationship. And right now, most of the groups that are funded by foundations that I'm aware of are not funded to actually bridge. And I'm not saying that we should drop everything you're doing and start funding bridging work. I'm saying you should drop everything you're doing and start funding bridging work. That should be a part of your portfolio. For years, we've talked about how do Blacks and Latinos start working together more closely. But the structure of the funding, the structure of our physical space, makes it hard. So yes, unless we actually create this new, more inclusive we, this larger we, that's the fight in the world today. Do we have this very narrow, exclusive we, and everybody else is othered? Or do we construct a larger we, where people can still have their multiple identities, but also identify with this larger we?
Yeah. So let me push on that just a minute. So you've also talked about, and others certainly, how racism, white supremacy is embedded in society's institutions, and certainly philanthropy is no exception to that. We certainly have our issues in that regard. I think about who sits on our governing boards, who makes up our staff, our positions of leadership. What are the racial justice impacts of who is making decisions and setting the strategy agenda? So those are all things that philanthropy sort of struggles with. So given all of that, what's your take on where philanthropy is in regard to all that?
Well, it's interesting. I've been doing this work a long time, and in the 1990s, even talking about race was hard. Mm-hmm. And again, Lori and I were talking about last night trying to get a grant through and having some, then would have been considered hard racial language, almost caused the grant not to go through. Only a few years ago, when President Obama was running for office and won, there was all the talk about a post-racial moment. So can't we just move beyond race? So just looking around this table, I don't believe anyone believes that right now. So we have a long way to go, mm-hmm. but we've made progress. And James Baldwin says, not everything you face can be solved, but nothing can be solved unless you face it. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that we're at least willing to talk about it, to me, is a move in the right direction. And, I think it's complicated, unfortunately, because the way we sort of grew up with race is thinking about Archie Bunker, mm-hmm. or thinking about two people interacting, one saying some racist stuff, and that still happens. But the majority of Americans, I would think, are not there. What's actually perpetuating the racial divide and the racial angst in this country is largely stories and structures that are not just at the individual level. And I think the foundations can play that, and play that while acknowledging its past. It doesn't mean ignoring our past, nor does it mean wallowing in guilt. That yes, all of us have privilege. I went to a bunch of fancy schools. I teach at Berkeley. I have privilege. The question is, how will I use that privilege? Will I use it in service of the larger humanity, or will I hoard it? And so I think philanthropy needs to actually look at that on multiple levels. And as you suggested, Fred, not just in terms of your grants, but also your investment, who controls your portfolio, and being proactive, being deliberate. So it's not just people, it's also structures, it's also stories, it's also where you invest. And can we do it together? Mm-hmm. Like I would be concerned if philanthropists, and certainly if just a bunch of white people went out by themselves to fix the race problem. But also I'd be concerned if white people weren't included in trying to address the race problem. So philanthropy has a role, and it's a complicated role because you have money, you have power. So how do you engage with people without overwhelming them with your money and power?
So thank you. So I want to return to a couple other slides as well. I find myself thinking about your slide on structure, and the fact that structures are not neutral, and the fact that that people are situated differently. And so, John, if I'm thinking about this correctly, where it takes me is it takes me to a place where I think philanthropy engaging in targeted approaches, especially in regard to systems change, becomes really, really important. But as I've been involved in philanthropy now for 20 years, and as I oftentimes see philanthropy shying away from a more targeted approach, especially if it has something to do with race. I think of our own foundation as we have taken a much more targeted approach in regard to racial equity. Some people have suggested this is potentially divisive. It's alienating. You have argued for and written about a targeted universalism approach. You talked about it earlier today again. So people use that term now. Sometimes I wonder if they are using it in the same way you meant it. So I want to ask you if you would talk a little bit about what you mean by targeted universalism and why you believe this is such a valuable approach to addressing disparities and moving toward racial equity.
That's a great question. So there's a big debates along a number of axes. One of them debates right now is identity politics destroying America? And so some people think that we should not focus on any identity, that we should just be, sometimes I say to my students, I want you to draw a picture of a person. And then they draw a picture of a person and say, what's the person's race, what's the person's gender? And I draw a person without a race, without a gender, without a religion. And they can't do it. We all have an identity. And what becomes most salient is the identity that's under attack. And so when you attack a people because of their accent, the accent becomes the most important. So if you focus on one group to the exclusion, and in fact to the put down of other groups, that is divisive. So that's how we think of identity politics. That's how we think of focusing and targeting. It's like we're only concerned about black people. We're only concerned about gay people. But targeted universalism says, look, we're all situated differently, but we're trying to get everybody. We're trying to get the guy in the wheelchair to the third floor, just like the people who are more ambulatory. So we build the escalators, not the elevator. We're not saying we're building an elevator because we think the guy in the wheelchair is special. We're saying he or she deserves the same thing as everyone else. So become targeted because we're situated differently. But here's the subtlety. Targeted universalism doesn't mean you just focus on the most marginal. It means you focus on everyone. They even have to be strategic at some point to get everyone to that universal goal, which means we have to begin by saying, what is the universal goal? And the way you get people there, the stories you tell to get people there, is going to be different. So in that sense, if you just do targeted, it might indeed be divisive. If you just do universal, it's going to be ineffective and it's telling people to forget their identities. But if you say, look, we all want this thing, but for me to get this, it's different than for you to get this. And I often tell the story about being at the Ohio State University, where if you rented a car on company time, not using company money, you had to rent a subcompact. And you might have noticed I'm a little tall. And they would say, Professor Powell, you need to rent a subcompact. I said, I'm not doing that. And they said, this is the universal rule. We're treating everybody the same. And I said, I bet a dime to a donut, the person who wrote that rule was under 6 feet.
And it went all the way, really, it went to the main, of all things unimportant. But eventually, they allowed me to rent full-size cars. Here's the thing.
They didn't change the rule. So then when I was riding around, people were saying, there goes Professor Powell in his big car. He thinks he's all that. And so sometimes we end up focusing on the people and not the structures themselves. And I wasn't the problem. It was the little car that was the problem. And so oftentimes when we look at populations, we overly focus on there's something wrong with black men, black boys. How do we fix them? As opposed to the structure is not serving them. How do we make the structure serve them well?
Mm-hmm. You know, I want to, your use of the word, how do you fix them? This is, again, something we talked about a couple weeks ago, so I want to go back to this. Can you expand on ways that philanthropy might make some shifts away from sort of the individual level? A lot of philanthropy is involved in fixing this problem, fixing this person, as opposed to focusing on structures and systems. I think I shared with you that our foundation made a decision a while back to focus at the organizational level because we thought that might have impact. So how do you see the concept of bridging, I guess is what I'm coming to, John, that you raised earlier, tied to this shift of this focus on structures and systems?
So again, I think, the Brooklyn DA office, they just did something fairly amazing, some of you may know. They had, and it's similar in California, but they had literally hundreds of thousands in this case, of black and Latinos being prosecuted for little things. And the disproportionate number of Latinos were either potentially undocumented or fear that they had family members who were undocumented. And so you can think again about how do you sort of deal with each one of these cases one at a time. What they did is they actually said, we aren't going to write summons for these petty crimes. We're actually going to affirmatively work on making people feel like they're part of the community. I'm going to Canada in a week or two, and they have something called 6 degrees there. When you become a Canadian citizen, they give you a pass for a year to go visit museums. They actually, all the museums, they give you a pass to actually ride public transit. They give you, in other words, they're affirmatively saying we're actually making our structures available to you. And if you go to their big museum, they have Native American art, and they don't have the Native American art section in the basement. They have Native American art distributed throughout the museum. They're saying that indigenous people is part of Canada today, not just a historical artifact. And as Canada moves forward, it needs to think about that all the time, not just once in a while. So we could change structures. Housing is a huge problem in California. And some people, when you talk to them, they say, well, my family in particular, they say, well, the Bible said the poor will always be among us. But the Bible didn't say they'd all be in the same place. So we could do something different. We could actually talk about inclusionary zoning in terms of housing and schools. We could actually then engage those communities. And that's at a structural level. And I don't think the individual level completely goes away. Structures do a lot of work, including distributing identity. But it doesn't do all the work. So we have to work at multiple levels. But there is a tendency in our country to overemphasize the individual.
Right. Yeah, and certainly we've seen that in philanthropy, but I think we also see more more foundations, focusing on systems change, focusing on working across structures, across sectors to a greater extent than
Let
before.
me mention just one other thing. So we had a conference called You Two Belong. We brought together returning citizens and undocumented immigrants. And the whole conference was about the issue about how those two groups are made other. And when the conference started, it was actually interesting because the returning citizens came to the conference. It's like, whoa, what are these people doing here? They're not even citizens. And the people who are undocumented immigrants, they walked in, it's like, oh, we're in a room with a bunch of ex-criminals. So they both had the dominant narrative about the other. And by the end, it was like one of the most powerful conferences that we had. And so I would think in terms of policies, how do you actually do policies to connect people? One concrete example is I'm working with a group in Michigan, and they're working with drug abuse. Well, they could work in the city of Detroit, or they could work in rural communities. Those are two very different communities, and they don't show up the same, but there's a deep theme that's actually in common. And so if you link those two, you have the bridge. You're constructing a policy and practice that actually allows people to bridge and also then experience each other's common humanity and suffering. Right?
So I want to turn to something else you've talked about, a concept you've written about, and that's the concept of whiteness. And I bring this up, John, because I know there are a lot of people in this audience that struggle with issues of privilege and how that might show up in their work. As you said earlier, there's a lot of power in this room. Our nonprofits like to refer to this as the power imbalance that people here think about on a regular basis. So I was struck last year at the Policy Link Summit. You were in a discussion with Angela Glover-Blackwell, and you were talking about how you build solidarity in movements. And Angela asked you about that. And in your response, you said something that I hope you might talk a little bit more about. You said that you can have solidarity with white people, but not with whiteness. So can you talk briefly about this concept of whiteness and what you meant in your answer with Angela?
Yes, and again, it's a very subtle thing, and I think I would even go beyond solidarity. Solidarity is the first step. I think we need, like I said, a new inclusive we, and it has to be everybody can be in this circle of human concern. No one's excluded. And so when I talk about whiteness, and I've written about it in my book, when I talk about whiteness, I'm not talking about people who are phenotypically white. I'm not talking about people who are born in Ireland and migrated to the United States or Germany. I'm talking about the concept of whiteness. Right. The concept of whiteness in its most pernicious form is an exclusive concept. It's predicated on the idea of supremacy and exclusion, domination and control. Control of nature, control of women. And part of the control is responding to fear and to things we don't understand. When we have fear, one of the ways to deal with it is, I just need to, so we like parks. We like parks, but not the forest, right? Parks we can control. Everything's in its place. The forest, that wolf might come up. So the idea is that the whiteness has always been organized around this deep anxiety. And so it already started off with a radical other, and particularly blacks. And think about this. In much of the United States, for much of our history, we had this concept that whiteness was both powerful and fragile. That one drop of black blood would destroy whiteness. I mean, black blood is some powerful stuff. Actually, there's no such thing as black blood. The idea is that the fragility of whiteness is what we're talking about. And the fragility existed in part because white was seen as pure. So anything that's pure is also extremely fragile and anxious. And so, in a sense, we have to invite people beyond that. We have to get beyond that. Very quickly, I went at a restaurant last night, and the chef was Korean and black. And the server was telling us, well, this is a multicultural restaurant. And I said, so what's your multicultural background? And she was taken aback and said, well, I did one of those DNA tests and I'm, 80% Irish and, 17% German. And yes, I was 3% Asian. And I said, congratulations. So part of it is sort of, the country's changing, the world is changing. But white people, and certainly even things associated with the culture of white people doesn't have to be under threat. Whiteness is under threat, and it should be under threat. And we should help it move out into a healthy demise, but we need something in this place. And it can't be just an attack on white people, but on the concept of exclusion and domination.
So it takes us back to who's involved, who's included.
And how we sort of identify ourselves. We're all, and I know we're about to run out of time, but we all have multiple identities. And if we can embrace our multiplicity, it's actually a healthy thing. And it really frees us up. It won't be easy. And it can't be just done at an individual level.
So we're going to ignore this clock for a couple of minutes because I'm in the discretion of the moderator, and they gave me permission anyway, John, to go a couple more minutes. I hope people don't mind. So I want to again go back to something we talked about a couple weeks ago, and I said to you that when I hear you talk, when I read your stuff, I see sort of the spiritual side of you sort of peeking through, and so I wanted to ask. And I think this is oftentimes something that people don't like to talk about, the spirituality word sometimes concerns people, but I wanted to talk about how spirituality might drive or influence your work, and what role you think that might have for all of us, actually.
Well, I think spirituality, it's interesting. My father's a Christian minister, and I just said I was in Detroit, and he just celebrated his 98th birthday.
Congratulations.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my siblings are not doing so well, and he's really freaking out. His children are sick, and I said, well, that's what you get for living so long. But so we don't, we sort of have, many of us, not all of us, have sort of a uncomfortable relationship with religion, and we sometimes conflate spirituality and religion. I think the meaning of life is profoundly a spiritual question, and we are embodied spirits. And we can't. The sort of false promise of liberalism is that you can decide yourself who you are and what life means to you. It's just not true. Mm-hmm. We're deeply connected to each other. There's a South African expression, I think it's called Ubuntu, which is mean I am because you are. We are deeply connected to each other. And to me, that's the heart of spirituality, is that we're deeply connected to each other, we're deeply connected to the earth. Mm-hmm. Now, I believe that's just a reality, but how we actually manifest that relationship, how we construct our lives around that relationship, to me, that's a profoundly spiritual practice. And so, in a sense, you could say the issue of othering and belonging is the issue of othering. I'm not connected to you. I don't want to be connected to you.
That's right.
At the height of the fight, when they were talking about doing away with Social Security, it wasn't because Social Security was costing too much money. It was because it was connecting a group of people, in this case, again, people who organized around whiteness, who didn't want to be connected to blacks or Latinos or others. So it wasn't the cost that people were objecting to, it was the social part of it, is that we're connecting people to each other. Mm-hmm. We're already connected. So how do we actually do that in a real way? And I believe that's deeply a spiritual practice. One last thing on that's important. On all these committees about the future of work, robots are coming, they're going to take over. And I always ask, so does that mean that black robots will make less than white robots? So part of the thing, they talk about universal basic income, which might happen, it might not. But the part that's missing in the conversation is what's the meaning of people's lives? And work has been one of the most important expressions of people's lives. If you take that away from people, and give them money and nothing else, you still have left them spiritually void. So spirituality is how we make meaning in the world today. And even though we may be a little uncomfortable about it, I think we have to have that conversation, just like we have to have a conversation about race.
Yeah. Well, John, thank you for that. So I wanted to ask you one last question that, in a way, bringing this all together, you and others have talked about moving towards a new social compact, and I know there's going to be a session on that. The last plenary session is going to focus on that. So can you talk a little bit about how that obviously fits with all that you've shared with us this morning?
Yes, and I think Chris sort of put it on the table earlier on when she talked about philanthropy stepping into the role of speaking out about separating the children. And we have these different segments. And so philanthropy, your job is to give money. Corporations, your job is to take money or make money. People, your job is to try to give money. It's like, so we have these different roles that people have. And so sometimes an issue comes up like separating children at the border, and it's like, well, that's not a corporate issue because that's not about money. It's not a philanthropy issue. That's not about, so stay in your lane. And that works okay when everything is working okay. Transactional interventions work when the structures are more or less working well, and you're trying to figure out some small tweaks. But when the structures themselves are called into question and you need transformation, then your lane is not so clear. And that's true for all of us, especially those of us who have influence or power. And so we need a compact. And implicitly, we work based on certain assumptions and certain values. We work on the assumption that some people are questioning now, that we all are of human dignity, that we all belong. If you're a Christian, you might say that we're all God's children. That's the assumption that we don't talk about it, we just work from that. We hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all men, scratch that, all people are created equally. It's self-evident. It means we don't even have to discuss it. That's the social compact that comes from the Declaration of Independence. But now people are saying, no, all people aren't equal. There's some people who are not equal. If you're Mexican, or if you're Muslim, or if you're transgendered, or if you're not equal. You're not even human. At an unconscious and conscious level, I reject your humanity. So once that's put on the table, we need to affirmatively state what our values are. Right. Those assumptions can no longer be in the background. And they have to animate our work, whether you are a foundation, whether you're a corporation, whether you're an individual. And so this calls for an explicit new compact leading into the 21st century. And we're working with the endowment and others, and hopefully as many of you, to sort of state that. And it's not a social compact for the Haas Institute or for the endowment. It's a social compact starting with for Californians and hopefully for the country and for the world. So that's what it's about. Those things become in sharp relief and needed to be explicit because they're under attack.
So thank you, John. I think I speak for everyone in this audience that it's been a great honor having you with us today, and I know you're going to be part of another session here in just a few minutes. Your work in the area of civil rights, racial justice, housing, poverty is so thought-provoking and has inspired all of us. So I want to say thank you for paying attention to philanthropy. We certainly need your voice. We learn from you on an ongoing basis. So thank you for that, John. I also want to remind people that John is going to be part of a session that's coming up at 10:30, between 10:30 and noon, applying a racial lens to grant making for people who are interested. I know we did not get 2 questions from the audience this morning, but that'll give you an opportunity for more time with John and some other panelists. The other thing I just want to remind people is that what we just talked about, there is a closing session that my colleague, Dr. Ross, is going to lead on a new American Social Compact. So a lot of exciting things yet to come. Chris, once again, great job in putting this together. And John, thank you very, very much. Okay. I think we're dismissed.